Welcome to silent screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1, The Echoes of the Changing Flesh. The road to Elmwood seemed endless, shrouded in thick, swirling fog that muffled the world beyond the headlights. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale as moonlight. The drive had been meant to clear her mind, a quick escape to a quaint village after the brutal breakup. Instead, it felt like she was driving straight into the maw of some unseen beast. Her GPS faltered, the screen flickering erratically before freezing entirely. The mechanical voice muttered incoherent directions before falling silent. Sarah cursed under her breath, pulling over at the edge of the forest. A wooden sign loomed out of the mist, its letters faded with age. Welcome to Elmwood, where time stands still. The words sent a chill crawling up her spine. Just as she was about to turn back, a figure appeared in the distance. A woman, dressed in a tattered shawl, her face obscured by the mist, raised an arm in greeting. Against her better judgment, Sarah rolled down the window slightly. Lost. Are you? The woman's voice was thin, reedy, yet oddly soothing. Yeah. My GPS stopped working, Sarah admitted. You'll find what you're looking for in Elmwood. But mind the faces you see, the woman said cryptically, her form dissolving into the mist before Sarah could respond. Sarah hesitated, but curiosity pulled her forward. Something about Elmwood felt wrong, but it also felt alive. The village of Elmwood appeared as if trapped in another era. Cobblestone streets twisted through rows of moss-covered houses, their windows aglow with dim, flickering lights. Villagers moved about, their faces strangely similar, smiling, yet unnervingly blank. Sarah checked into the only inn, the hollow hearth run by an elderly man named Arthur. His gaze lingered on her a moment too long. Strangers don't come here often, he murmured. Just passing through, Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone light. Well, if you hear the bells at night, don't look out your window, Arthur warned, his voice dropping to a whisper. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the moonlight pooling on the empty street below. Then came the sound, a low, mournful bell tolling through the fog. Against Arthur's warning, she parted the curtains slightly. The street was no longer empty. Figures, tall and gaunt, moved silently in the moonlight. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, their faces pale and shimmering, as if struggling to hold their form. Sarah recoiled in terror. But before she could step away, one of them turned. Its eyes locked onto hers, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. The next morning, Sarah tried to dismiss what she had seen. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on her. She wandered into the village square, hoping for normalcy. Instead, she found a market unlike any she had ever seen. Tables lined with jars of glistening, fleshy substances. Vendors hawked goods in whispers, a new face for a new life, one murmured, holding up a jar of what looked disturbingly like human skin. Sarah's stomach churned. But no one else seemed to find this strange. A woman approached her, her features eerily similar to Sarah's own. New in town? She asked, her voice unnervingly familiar. Sarah nodded, unable to tear her gaze from the woman's face. It was like staring into a distorted mirror. They call us shifters, the woman continued, leaning in close. We can be anyone. Even you. The market dissolved into chaos as a bell tolled once more. Louder and more frantic than the night before. The villagers dropped their wares and fled. Their forms shifting grotesquely as they ran. Sarah turned. Only to find herself face to face with the woman again, or at least someone wearing her face. "You shouldn't have come here," the doppelganger hissed. Her skin rippling unnaturally. Sarah fled back to the inn. But the safety she sought was gone. Arthur was no longer behind the counter. Instead, a man with Arthur's face stood there. His smile stretched too wide. "You saw too much," he said. His voice distorted. "Now, you're part of us." Panic gripped her as she ran upstairs, barricading herself in her room. The walls seemed to close in, pulsating like living flesh. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. "Let me in," a voice whispered from the other side of the door. It was her own voice. Sarah screamed, backing away as the door began to splinter. The doppelganger burst through, its form shifting violently between shapes, her ex-boyfriend. The woman in the market. "Arthur. You'll wear the mask too," it hissed, reaching out with hands that seemed to stretch infinitely. Sarah awoke in darkness, her body bound by something sticky and warm. She was no longer in the inn but in a cavern beneath the village. The walls glistened with a strange, viscous substance. And around her, villagers shed their skins like snakes. Their true forms were hollow, featureless figures, their identities stolen and worn like garments. A chorus of whispers filled the air. "Join us. Become one of many." They surrounded her, offering a mask of flesh. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The mask pressed against her face, melding with her skin. Memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. Lives she had never lived. As the transformation completed, she felt her own identity slipping away, consumed by the collective. She was no longer Sarah. She was everyone. And she was no one. Months later, a new stranger drove into Elmwood, their GPS faltering as they entered the fog. At the edge of the forest, a woman in a tattered shawl waved them down. Her face was familiar, too familiar. "Lost. Are you?" she asked, her voice thin and reedy, yet oddly soothing. And so, the cycle began again. Story 2, The Echoes of the Changing Flesh. Isabella had spent most of her life chasing legends. As a researcher of folklore, she prided herself on her ability to separate superstition from fact. But nothing prepared her for the hollow woods, an untouched wilderness on the outskirts of her hometown, known for mysterious disappearances and eerie folklore. Locals whispered of the hollow reflections, shapeshifters who mirrored the faces of their prey, stalking them until they were lured to their doom. To Isabella, it sounded like another exaggerated ghost story. But when her childhood friend Lucas vanished after camping in those woods, the stories clawed at her mind. Determined to find answers, she packed her gear and set out alone into the shadowy wilderness. The forest was unnervingly quiet. Isabella's flashlight carved through the dense trees, revealing an unnatural stillness. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon Lucas's abandoned campsite. His tent lay collapsed, his belongings scattered as though he had left in a hurry. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows. "Lucas?" Isabella called out, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward. The man looked exactly like Lucas, down to the freckle beneath his left eye. But something was wrong, his movements were jerky. His smile stretched too wide. Isabella felt her blood turn cold. "Isa," the figure said. His voice a near-perfect mimicry of Lucas's. But off-key. As if spoken through broken glass. Instinct screamed at her to run. But her legs felt rooted to the ground. Slowly. The mimic of Lucas tilted its head. And from behind him, another figure emerged, a second Lucas. Identical in every way. The second Lucas's voice was softer. Pleading. "Isabella. Please help me." Her heart pounded as she stumbled back. Two Lucas lookalikes. One laughing eerily. The other begging for help. Which one was real, or were they both fake? Isabella fled deeper into the woods. Her mind spinning. Her flashlight flickered. And darkness pressed in. She heard footsteps echoing hers. Quickening when she tried to quiet her movements. When she stopped to catch her breath. She felt a presence behind her. Turning slowly. She gasped. It was herself. The doppelganger stared at her with unblinking eyes. Its face expressionless. But then, it spoke. "You don't belong here," it hissed. The voice distorted and alien. "Leave before they take you." Before Isabella could react, the doppelganger melted into the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. What were these creatures? As night deepened, Isabella came across a small clearing bathed in moonlight. A circle of smooth, reflective stones glimmered at its center. She crouched to inspect one and was startled to see her reflection staring back, not just her face, but her exact movements. As if the stone was a perfect mirror. Then the reflections started moving on their own. Her mirrored self stepped out of the stone and stood before her. This time, it wasn't passive. It lunged forward, knocking her to the ground. "Why do you run from yourself?" it whispered. Its grip cold and unyielding. Isabella screamed and scrambled away, clutching a sharp stick. She swung wildly. And the doppelganger let out a guttural cry before collapsing. When she looked again, the body was gone. And only the stone remained. At the heart of the forest, Isabella found an ancient, crumbling cabin. Its walls were covered in strange symbols. And a cold wind seemed to hum with whispers. Inside, she discovered a journal, its pages filled with warnings about the shapeshifters and their rules. The final entry read, "Do not trust what you see. They will mirror you. But they cannot replicate your soul. Use that against them." Just as she finished reading, the door slammed shut. And the air grew frigid. Shadows began to converge. Taking form, her form. Dozens of identical Isabellas surrounded her. Their eyes hollow and cruel. "Give up," one of them said. "You cannot escape yourself." Desperation gripped her as she remembered the journal's words. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a lighter and held it to her arm. The pain searing and sharp. The shapeshifters recoiled. Their forms flickering. "You're not real," Isabella said through gritted teeth. "And you'll never be me." The creatures let out a collective scream. Their bodies disintegrating into ash. The cabin trembled. And Isabella bolted outside as it collapsed behind her, sealing the horrors within. Days later, Isabella returned to town. Her ordeal feeling like a fever dream. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, half expecting it to move on its own. As she turned to leave, the reflection smirked. She froze. The lights flickered. And when she looked again, the reflection was gone. The hollow reflections weren't done with her yet. Story 3, The Skinwalker's Reflection. Emily had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Growing up in the bustling city, tales of shapeshifters and skinwalkers seemed like relics of another time. Myths meant to scare children. But when her family inherited an old, isolated cabin deep in the Appalachian woods, she found herself surrounded by the kind of eerie silence that made her doubt everything she thought she knew. The first sign came on her second night. While brushing her teeth in the cabin's dimly lit bathroom, she noticed her reflection lingering just a second too long after she moved. Emily froze, staring at her mirror image. It stared back with an unsettling intensity. "Just my imagination," she whispered, shaking her head. But the reflection didn't shake its head. Emily decided to investigate the cabin's history. An old photo album tucked beneath the floorboards revealed pictures of the previous occupants, her distant relatives. Each photo was oddly unsettling, the family members' eyes hollow and vacant. In the last photo, a handwritten note scrawled on the back read, "Beware the echo, it is not you." The following day, Emily explored the surrounding woods. She felt watched. The kind of primal, unshakable sensation that made her heart race. The whispers began faintly, like the wind weaving through the trees. "Emily." She spun around. But no one was there. The whispers grew louder. That night, Emily woke to the sound of scratching at her bedroom window. Pulling back the curtains, she saw herself staring in, her reflection grinning with sharp, inhuman teeth. Emily stumbled back, tripping over the corner of the rug. When she looked again, the window was empty. But the sound of footsteps echoed from downstairs. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept into the living room. Her reflection stood there, motionless, in the mirror above the fireplace. This time, it was no longer mimicking her movements. It tilted its head, its neck cracking unnaturally. "I'm not you," it whispered, its voice like rustling leaves. Desperate, Emily drove to the nearest town, an hour away, and sought answers from the locals. At the bar, an elderly man named Frank grew pale when she mentioned the cabin. "You shouldn't be there," he said, his voice trembling. "That land is cursed. The echo takes what it wants. It wears your face, and it's never satisfied." Frank explained that the echo was a shape-shifting entity, born from the land's ancient curse. It could mimic anyone it encountered. But its copies were always wrong. Once it gets close enough, it doesn't just take your face. Frank added, "It takes your life." Armed with what little she could, salt, a rusted iron knife, and a string of protective charms, Emily returned to the cabin. As she stepped inside, the air felt heavier, suffocating. Her reflection was waiting for her in the living room, sitting casually on the couch. "You can't win," it said, its voice perfectly mirroring hers. Emily lunged, slashing with the knife. The echo shrieked, its face distorting into a grotesque, inhuman form before shifting back into hers. "You're only hurting yourself," it hissed, blood dripping from its wounds, her wounds. Emily ignored the words, driving the blade deeper. The cabin trembled, and the echo let out a piercing wail before collapsing into a heap of blackened ash. Exhausted, Emily cleaned the mess and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face looked back, pale and tired. But as she turned to leave, the reflection stayed behind. It smiled,